So I suppose there's yacht builders in the past in Gosport as well.
Yeah.
The question I have for you is, at what point do you feel like you mentioned the 100-year-old sailing ships?
Yeah.
And for Marine Festival, we have some of the historic fleet that's based over at Boathouse 4 come over. And my question for you is, like, at what point should a ship become a museum ship and be out of the water, or should it always continue going on? How do you feel about that?
Potentially people will debate a lot about that subject, I guess.
How do you feel about it?
So,
then,
well, I think boats are always better being used.
Right.
And all manner of problems come with them not being used. I'm not a naval architect, but I believe Victory is struggling because she's out of the water and her hull is not being supported as designed by the water. So therefore there's problems because there's more weight pushing down on the hull than she was designed for. Does that make sense?
Right.
Because she hasn't got the buoyancy of the water holding her up. We're very fortunate in the UK that the regulations for safety of vessels have allowed us to continue using traditional vessels for sail training. So, for example, Jolly Breeze that I mentioned is fully coded, which means it's a bit like an MOT for sailing vessels. So it means you've got all the right equipment. We've got life rafts, we've got enough buoyancy, we've got radios, we've got ways of calling for help. That's all a legal requirement if you want to take passengers to sea, or if your skipper is paid, for example. You're basically a commercial vessel.
Probably critical for parents whose
Absolutely.
kids are going out sailing as well, right? They want to know that they're going to be kept safe.
Very reassuring, yeah. But other countries, when the regulators looked at the requirements and the rules, have not been so kind as the UK regulators, the MCA, Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. So in Germany about 10 years ago, the traditional sector was very concerned because new rules were being proposed that would not have allowed traditional vessels, because there's certain things like guardrails. Yeah, these days we require 60 centimetre high guardrails on coded vessels. That's a legal requirement. Some traditional vessels might say, well, it doesn't look very pretty to have wires around the edge. I just want my low little wooden footrail. So that, to be fair, Jolly Breeze has got guardrails, and that has been put in, and it doesn't actually look too intrusive. I know some of the, I'll come back to that in a second, some of the traditional racing yachts don't like it. But the other thing is, for example, modern build vessels need to have a certain number of structural features, like the cabins has to be a certain size or your bunks have to be a certain size. But they've allowed grandfather rights, so existing vessels who are already commercially certified don't have to suddenly upgrade to the new requirements. Yeah, and that has allowed us.
That seems very logical. So, and that's the kind of thing it feels like in a, say, parallel thing of like motor vehicles. If you've got a classic car, you're not suddenly going to have to throw it away or work out how to put an electric put an electric engine in it these days. Yeah. You know, as long as you can still get hold of the petrol, I suppose. Yeah, and stuff like that. Yeah. So I understand that. So that's what's allowed people to continue going on with these heritage vessels.
Yeah. So I mean, going back slightly to your question. Sorry, I went off in a technical
it's
slant there. I think if boats can be used, then that's brilliant. At some point, I suppose it might be better for them to become a museum vessel. In a lot of cases, I would say that's a financial decision. There was a few years ago, somebody wanted to build a replica of the Cutty Sark, for example, and sail her. We didn't sort of officially campaign, but my feeling was I'd rather money goes towards boats that are already sailing, that need the funding in order to take young people to sea, rather than putting it all in a really expensive new project that would then need ongoing maintenance to keep it going. So yeah, sometimes it's probably the wise decision to turn them into a museum vessel. And it's not my expertise, but there's National Historic Ships who support those vessels and give advice on how to restore it and how to keep it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for... I understand you're not an expert, but it's really interesting to kind of examine that question and that insight that you were saying about Victory versus Warrior, which kind of, she's a museum ship, but she's in the water. So it's kind of very different. And I always think it's interesting. And if you can keep things, I often think if things are working and functioning, they've got that's almost that is their life in a way. I think we've got the Hovercraft Museum in the borough of Gosport as well, which is very personal to me. I literally live across the road from it. And I think one of the disappointing things people often find is these are on the most point decommissioned things. They don't run. Their engines in most cases have been removed or used for spares or things like that. And that can be disappointing for people, I think.
We used these hovercrafts when I was a kid. When we were travelling to England every summer holiday, we always came on the hovercraft.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that's linked
in fact, it's quite funny that it's now a museum piece.
Well, that's another Gosport story that I will, if trustees of the Hovercraft Museum, I need to get in contact with you and get you in to tell that story, because that is another really Gosport and Solent based story where you've got that the trials unit there in Lee on the Solent, which, yes, we can have a whole debate about whether Lee is Gosport or not, but it's currently in the borough, so I'm going to include it. But yes, so really interesting points there, and I really it's clear to me that this is your passion, this has been your life. And so kind of to go back to your story there, we talked about you coming to Gosport, the Sea Cadets being based at Fort Blockhouse, and you skippering a vessel there. And I suppose the question is, was that kind of really... I've got a question here that, like, what was your first real job? But I suppose the real question is, how did that mature through time, or how did you find that, particularly being in Gosport? Like, what was it like?
Yeah, debatable what a real job is. But so I said earlier, I sailed for about 10 years on lots of different types of vessels, not all with young people sort of sail training, but some also the more traditional teaching sailing, and also sort of adult adventure holidays.